It's a hard job. Being a CISO in 2025, it is stressful, chronically, often underfunded. There's an ongoing discussion around outsourcing versus insourcing. I guess from my point of view, I think it's maybe too purist to kind of say one is higher or lower risk than the other. Unfortunately, nowadays, every organisation is a target.
Welcome to The Insight in 15, the podcast from KPMG that cuts to the chase on the big issues facing business leaders. I'm Stuart Burt, and today we're going to be talking about cybersecurity. I'm delighted to be joined by someone who knows a thing or two about that, Cliodhna Potter, the Cybersecurity Transformation Director here at KPMG. Welcome to the podcast, Cliodhna.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Now, Cliodhna, there's a lot out there that covers the big risks that businesses face and some of the ways in which you might most effectively respond. What I want to focus on today is some of the big questions that you get from business leaders, the ones that are challenging to answer and that they often struggle to get a clear response on. What are those questions?
Yeah, I think some of the probably big ones at the moment, I would say, are cyber insurance. It's so expensive right now. Organizations are asking, do I need it? Second, I would say outsourcing. CISO's wondering, what is it safe to outsource? And the one all CISOs are asking is, what should be the reporting line within the organisation for a CISO?
Okay, well, we've got 15 minutes and no more, so let's get to it.
Let's
start with that first one on cyber insurance. So how important is cyber insurance for a business? Is it something that they absolutely should have?
Yeah, I mean, very important. I would say now in 2025, I think there would be few organisations that probably couldn't have some level of it.
But I was going to ask about cost, because clearly there are some sectors that are more exposed and some that perhaps have more sensitive data and are at greater risk of being attacked on the cyber front. Is this something that's reserved to large businesses only, or if you're mid-market, if you're SME, is it something that you should be considering as well?
What's important to remember is, unfortunately, nowadays, every organisation is a target. I think sometimes when we think about this, we think of kind of, nowadays more sophisticated attackers, and they're sitting there looking for, huge brands or big companies to attack, which of course does happen. But in reality, if you're a, 17-year-old, hacker and you just want some, cash for that weekend, you're not going to go against, one of the biggest organizations in the country. You're going to go for a local business who you have a good idea maybe haven't put that good of cyber defenses, and get in there and get some, quick data or cash out. The reality is that premiums are high. They've come down a little bit recently, but generally they are high. And so, I understand why businesses are weighing that up. But I would say in 99.9% of cases, insurance is going to be required.
What does it cover, and also what does it not cover?
Obviously, it depends on your agreement, the premium that you get. But what could be covered is everything from immediate incident response through to rebuilding the tech environment. It can cover media response and communications after an incident, legal fees, regulatory fines, as well as operational impacts. So up to even kind of sales impact from an incident. In terms of what it doesn't cover, I suppose ultimately there's, the threshold of what you need to go over to call on it. And like all insurance, you are selective in terms of when you call down insurance because of the future impact from a premium perspective.
And how do you choose when you're a business? Presumably there's a lot of providers out there. What are the sorts of things that they should be looking out for when deciding what insurance to take out?
Yeah, there is a lot of providers out there. I think one of the key ones is who is the panel of incident response providers. So in the moment, if an attack happens, the first thing you'll be presented with is this list of incident response kind of partners who are going to come into your organization and potentially be there, over a number of weeks working closely with you. So I think it's going through that list and, the different fee models with those different organizations and identifying someone in there that you feel you would trust to work with you.
And one of the things that you mentioned before was around media advice and I guess reputation? Because for me, one of the big things, if I think about cyber attacks, is one of the most costly impacts is reputation. And
Huge.
my instinct was that isn't something that you can insure against, but is there something that you can do to protect your reputation ahead of one of those attacks?
Yeah, 100%. And that is really the big area. I see both because I handle a lot of post-incident that maybe organisations regret not having done more in advance of, or ones that are more prepared or are putting the time in. So I suppose in terms of preparedness, a big one would be to make sure that you have someone on retainer. A media organization, a media management organization, or a law firm maybe who specializes in this, or a consulting firm, who would be available then at very short notice. If you work with them in advance, then they can also pre-prepare some comms, and you can spend time with them so that they understand your business, they understand the audiences.
And those are examples, I guess, of where some firms have decided to outsource parts of it, be it media, be it legal, as you say, or consultancy. It does touch on that second issue that you raised at the start, which is around to what extent can you outsource cybersecurity? If you're a business leader thinking about this, what can you outsource and what should you really be leaving in-house? How do you get that balance right?
Yeah, I think there's a few different reasons why people outsource, and maybe that's worth kind of reflecting on. I suppose one reason people do it, probably the most common, is cost. It's a way to prevent hiring, as many people required in-house. That's why we see one of the most common is 24/7 monitoring. So where you have, people available 24/7 who are monitoring the screens for alerts. To have a full team in-house doing that would be a lot of people if you want to cover 24/7. And obviously, it's not, unfortunately, that helpful to only have that Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. Attackers aren't packing up their bags at 5 on a Friday, the opposite, in fact. So that's pretty common. Other would be highly operational or kind of transactional parts, maybe things like third-party security assessments where it's kind of high volume and repeatable. And finally, probably the big areas we see is maybe where it's more like a service, a specialist area where, so say something like threat hunting or penetration testing, where you think we're not doing this all the time, but there are times where we need it, so we won't hire in-house. We'll, get really skilled services externally to focus on that.
And is there one thing that is a non-negotiable you should absolutely keep in-house?
The responsibility always stays with the CISO, which is probably why it's quite a stressful job nowadays. And so, one should never outsource something that you feel you would fully lose control over, because ultimately if there's an attack, no one is going to, thank you because you say that it was a third party who did it. So I think there are, parts of internal kind of a security architecture, engineering, maybe risk advice that you'll always want to keep in-house. I think it's about having people who stay in the organization who can stay close to the other business teams. You want the people in-house to be partnering. You want tech teams to know them, to pick up the phone to them, to have that relationship where if you're developing something and you just think, oh, I'm just a bit nervous if I've got this right, have I got the access controls right here, and that there's internal people who they can have that relationship with, but also security people who are embedded enough to understand the environment so that they will spot things that they will think is strange when they change. So I think there always is a place for that kind of an internal team of people who face off to the business day to day.
And from an outsider perspective, if you look at all the headlines around what's happening elsewhere in terms of attacks, my assumption would be that there's going to be a push more to bring things in-house over time. Is that right, or is that a wrong assumption?
There's an ongoing discussion around outsourcing versus insourcing. I guess from my point of view, I think it's maybe too purist to kind of say one is higher or lower risk than the other. External people make mistakes, internal people make mistakes. Ultimately what's important is having, a robust control environment we call defense in depth, which is regardless of who's, delivering that part, that there's another control behind that and another control. So if the attacker, gets through your service desk, there's another control that kicks in that spots that they're now in your network. Regardless of delivery model, you should have layers of backup, for want of a better word, of controls.
And as you say, ultimately responsibility does end up being in-house, often on a day-to-day with the Chief Information Security Officer. So you mentioned at the start that there's debate around where the CISO sits. Why is that a question? Why are businesses struggling to answer that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes back to really the kind of evolving role of the CISO over the last few years. It was historically maybe seen in more of a narrow view, quite security operations heavy, quite technical in the background, maybe within a chief information officer technology function. Whereas I think the role now has become much broader, business facing role. Interacts a lot with the front of the business itself. That's the commercial parts of the organization, legal teams, risk teams, and that's really starting to question whether it being housed within the CIO technology function is maybe misleading or doesn't give it as a role the freedom to interact with these other parts of the organization. I think that combined with boards and senior management wanting to have more direct access to information that isn't filtered through another member of the leadership team, i.e. the CIO or chief risk officer in some organizations. For me, I guess ultimately I think what's important is that those senior bodies have access to transparent information, and the reporting line in some ways becomes irrelevant as long as you set up those mechanisms where the CISO is able to, without, prejudice or impact, be able to report directly to the board on where they're worried, where they feel they need more investment, where they're not getting things from other departments, other members of the C-suite, and able to get that information up so that the board can make decisions to keep the organisation secure. The CISO had a serious role to do in 2025.
Yeah, and presumably the CISO has been called up to the board quite a lot right now for scrutiny as to what an organisation is doing. You mentioned the boards there. How are boards approaching this? Are they asking the right questions? Are they getting better at it? Are they recruiting the right people onto those boards who have that knowledge to scrutinise the CISO and others?
It is a big challenge at the moment. I mean, frankly, just the pure reality is that there is a shortage of talent purely in the cybersecurity market, and that is at all levels. So, there isn't a kind of abundance of people around to support with this. I think boards are increasingly seen, if they don't have someone with cybersecurity knowledge, that it's really important to get that in there. Obviously, non-exec director is a pretty common way of doing that, or maybe a dedicated advisor who sits on the board who has that ability to challenge from a cybersecurity perspective.
Thank you. Well, we promised that we would keep this to 15 minutes, so we're going to try and stick to that. Before we do, just one final question. If there's one thing that you want our listeners in business to take away and do today to protect themselves on cybersecurity, what would that be?
Yeah, I'm always, as many people in cybersecurity, cautious of kind of one thing and, that there's any silver bullet to this. But ultimately, I think it's that transparency of information. I think it's having that honest conversation. If you're another business leader with the CISO around you, do they really have what they need to protect the organization? It's a hard job being a CISO in 2025. It is stressful, chronically, often underfunded, legacy tech issues in the organization. And I think having that conversation with them to check in on what they actually need to protect the organization is really important.
Perfect. Thank you. So that is us out of time. Just time to say thank you, Cliodhna, for all your insights today on the podcast. If you do like the podcast, please do like and subscribe on Spotify, on YouTube, and on Apple Podcasts. And we'll see you again on The Insight in 15.